Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Welcome back to this four-part series. This is the fourth and final part of this series, and features my guest, Samantha McCoy. If you've been following this series and reading the episode notes, you already know the reason these four guests have been so important to me and the Sexual Assault Survivor Stories podcast. Mac McDonald, Jennifer Jones, Ellie Freeman, and Samantha McCoy are the four people who came up to me after a panel discussion in which they had participated to tell their stories of being raped while college students in New York State. They told me after their panel that they had been in the audience earlier that day when I was teaching about trauma-informed interviewing and the neuroscience of trauma and memory. They said that I should start a podcast to spread that same information onto other victims and survivors of rape, because the information had resonated with them and helped them to understand the post-traumatic stress symptoms they were experiencing. Finally, years later, this podcast has become a reality, and all four of those panel participants have followed through on their commitment to me to being a guest on this show. Please read the episode notes about Samantha McCoy. You will be impressed by all that she has accomplished and continues to work on in doing her part to bringing justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. And please listen carefully to Samantha's story. It could be just the thing that you need to hear today for assurance that you're not alone, for confidence in growing your survival experience, and for an education on how victims and survivors should be believed and treated with respect. That's what Samantha would want. Here she is. So, Sam, welcome to the podcast. It is so great to have you part of this, and thank you for being willing to do it.
Oh, of course. Thank you so much. I'm honored.
I know you've said that, even in my preparation and getting you scheduled and stuff, you've said that you're honored. Could you tell our audience a little bit about why you're so enthusiastic about being part of this podcast?
Yeah, so, honestly, everything that I have put my work and effort into has been to make a difference and help somebody who might be going through this experience, because it is so isolating and alone. I just am hopeful that this will help somebody.
And I know it will. I'm so appreciative of those comments, because that's exactly what this podcast is all about, is reaching out to other victims and survivors, but also people who have loved ones and friends and relatives who've also been assaulted, but maybe even for, as I've said in my previous podcasts, part of what this is for is law enforcement and medical personnel and mental health professionals on how to understand and recognize and deal with the trauma that victims and survivors go through, and why our brains do what our brains do. So we're going to talk somewhat about the neuroscience and some of your experience with that too, if you're okay to go there.
Yeah, that's fine.
So Sam, what I'd like to do is just have you start wherever you want to start and tell us what you're able to tell us about your sexual assault.
So I normally do not feel comfortable kind of sharing the details of the actual attack, because it's honestly incredibly painful to speak about, even though it's been years later. But what I am comfortable sharing is that I was 22 at the time that I was raped. He was a police officer, and unfortunately, he recorded the rape and had distributed that video to others, which was incredibly devastating to me. Subsequent to the attack, I had physical injuries, but by far the worst pain I felt was the mental anguish and the betrayal that I felt following the attack. A lot of where I felt an additional betrayal was honestly reporting and going through the law enforcement process. I was very scared to come forward just because of his position as an officer, and that deciding factor was honestly not being able to live with myself had I decided not to report, and then he would be free to harm someone else. And since he was in a position of power, I felt that was even more important. So at the time, I felt incredibly alone. I was embarrassed and ashamed. I felt violated. I had no experience with reporting to law enforcement before, and I didn't know really what to expect, but my experience, I felt, was horrific, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody. The first person I did tell was my mom, and she was incredibly supportive. To this day, I credit her so much because she immediately, it wasn't, you hear stories of survivors being not believed and questioned by those that are closest to them. And I think that would have been that much harder for me to have to go through this experience. But I'm so fortunate that I have the mom that I have. And she had offered to go with me to report to the police. And during that process, it was incredibly traumatic. I was treated horrible in the sense that I had to sit in law enforcement interviews for hours and hours. They would switch officers frequently, have me start from the beginning and repeat what happened again. I was asked questions that victims of other crimes aren't asked, like, if you were unconscious, then how do you know you didn't consent? And I wasn't allowed to have anybody in the room with me, so I had no victim advocate. My mom wasn't even allowed in the room with me. And yeah, so I'll take a breath right there because I feel like I just felt a lot. But
yeah, it's worthy of a breath right there. So many questions, I'm sure, come up in our listeners' minds and mine too, because it's been a while since I've heard your story. Sam, you mentioned that this rape was recorded. Were you aware that that was happening when it was happening?
I was not. I was not conscious. I was not in the video that I unfortunately saw at a later date. I was not moving.
Are you able to tell us how this whole thing evolved? What started this process?
As far as the assault?
Yeah.
I really I don't know. I don't know that I can answer that.
What are you able to remember in terms of pre-assault behaviors or location?
What I do remember is him being very angry. I vaguely remember at some point him grabbing my face and yelling at me, though I don't necessarily recall what it was about. I do know he had shoved other people in the public place that we were at the time. And then the next thing I remember is waking up, and I pretty quickly had bruises on me, and I had injuries, and obviously I knew something had happened.
Tell us more, if you could, about knowing something had happened.
Physical pain, and just a sense of things just were not right. It didn't add up. I remember calling my mom and kind of explaining what I was experiencing. And at that point, I had no idea there was a video. So I was just trying to seek guidance from my mom as to what she would have thought. And she had kind of encouraged me to go to the emergency room and seek out help.
I can't imagine the sense that you must have felt in terms of shock and despair and trauma. Are you in a place now where you could tell us what those thoughts and feelings were when you came to?
When I had realized what had happened, and after seeing the video, I think that's when things hit the hardest, because I couldn't deny it in my head anymore. I just felt incredibly violated. I felt disgusting. I felt used, betrayed. I was very ashamed and embarrassed, but also just angry, I think.
I am so sorry for the experience that you went through, and so thankful that you're even willing to talk about it this evening. Sam, how did it come to pass that you were able to know of and see the video?
First, he admitted having it, but the fact that he distributed it and other people had known it and described it. I don't really remember the sequence of how all of that played out, because I think that was the hardest part for me. So I think I've just tried to block all of that out. So I don't know that I can give you a straight, clear answer on that.
No, that makes sense. What are you able to tell us about in terms of some of the other treatment? You described the way the police handled this. Can you tell us more about that experience of reporting it and how the situation evolved from that point?
So my mother went with me to the police station. We both thought that was what you're, supposed to do, is the right thing to do. I kind of told her about not being able to cope with the fact that I was just this person that's in this position of power would be able to access others. When I got there, I had originally talked to a few officers, and then they switched and I had to repeat more and switched again. And they said, well, this officer didn't hear what you said, so please start from the beginning and explain it all again. So I would do that, and then they would bring in another officer and say, well, he didn't hear that, so if you could go ahead and repeat it again. And I could not tell you how long I was there, but I know it was hours, and I know it was the most draining thing I've ever had to experience. After that, then they said, well, we should probably get you medical treatment. So they went with me to the emergency room. The emergency room had no trained sexual assault nurse examiner. It was very kind of chaotic. It almost seemed like they didn't necessarily, and this is a rural place, just to kind of preface that resources might not have been the same as they are in other places. But after being in the emergency room that long, they were taking photographs of injuries, doing evidence collection, everything that they do medically. And then the officers came into the emergency room and said, okay, well, now you can go ahead and take us to the location of the crime. And at this point, it was almost 2 a.m. I just remember feeling like so lost and exhausted, and I was just trying to do what they were telling me to do, but I felt like just incredibly overwhelmed, and that they were completely, looking back, insensitive to the fact of I'm just trying to get through this, and I think I'm doing the right thing by reporting this. And it just felt like I couldn't even have a minute to catch my breath or sleep.
Yeah.
So we went to the location of the crime, and they took photographs, collected more evidence. And by the time they were done, it was very early in the morning. And they said, well, if you could come to the station first thing at, I think it was like 7 or 8 a.m. to continue questioning. So I got no sleep and went back, and they did the same thing the next day. They brought in new officers, and I had to start from the beginning again.
Wow.
This time it felt more accusatory, as if I was the one that had done something wrong. And that's when they started questions like, if you were unconscious, well, then how did you know you didn't consent? Using intimidation tactics, bringing in additional people. I had asked at some point, because I was feeling so uncomfortable. I just wanted my mom to be in the room, and they told me no.
Wow.
Yeah, I'll take another breath.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much there that it's just hard to talk about.
For sure. I get that. When I do a trauma-informed interview like this, I'm really try to be sensitive with the questions I ask to exactly what you're doing in terms of wanting to take a break and giving you that opportunity and things like that, and not asking questions that re-traumatize, because the whole purpose of a trauma-informed interview, if you remember, is to let the victim, survivor, feel as though they are in control of the interview, because you are. I not only feel it, but know it and actualize it. since you were unconscious, I know that a lot of the questions that they asked were just totally irrelevant, and it just bothers me that they would do that.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Sam, are you able to tell us what happened with the report? Did it go anywhere as far as an investigation?
I complied for months and months on end with every request that they had wanted. They wanted to get my phone to do a forensic search for some reason. I let them do it. They had my phone for quite a while. They asked me if I would take a polygraph. I agreed. They would show up at my work, flashing their badges, demanding to talk to me in the middle of my workday and embarrassing me in front of coworkers. And it finally got to the point where I sought out my own lawyer, just in the sense of I didn't know what to do. And I wanted to see if there was a way that he could help me get justice for what had happened. Unfortunately, despite everything that I had to go through and everything that I tried, they ultimately said that there was no case, and that it was a he said, she said, and that the perpetrator had deleted the video and it was not recoverable, even though they had witnesses who had saw the video and described it, and he had admitted the video existed and that I wasn't moving in the video. All of that, I guess, didn't matter. So criminal-wise, nothing happened to him. I wasn't going to give up, though, because I, again, could not live with myself sitting there thinking he could be an officer and hurting someone else. So I started looking at other avenues that I could get justice. I filed a Title IX investigation with my university. Although he wasn't a student there was some loophole they were able to find where basically they were able to continue with the investigation. I successfully won that Title IX hearing. I had to go through a full hearing. I didn't have an attorney, but he did. And it was in a panel of 3 people and did the whole Title IX process. He was ultimately banned from campus property. And that was the first time that I felt some protection. And this was probably 8 months after the assault that I finally was able to get the first sense of protection. And then through that, I was able to get a protective order in the court system. And then he was ultimately forced to resign. But it took almost 11 months of me fighting for that to happen. And it was a long year.
I'm sure. Tell our audience a little bit about what you do now. And I know, but it would be great if you could just fill in for our audience purposes, because I'm going to ask some questions that kind of go along legal lines, what you do now.
Yeah, so I'm an attorney now. Through this entire process, I went to law school because of what happened to me, because the system failed me. My attorney at the time had told me, semi-jokingly, I think, but he said there is no justice in the justice system. And that kind of stuck with me, and I just couldn't let it go. And I was like, well, that's not right. Like, if this is a system that we built to protect people, and if it's not doing its job, something needs to change. And I decided to channel all of like my anger and hurt and all of my feelings to basically advocate for changes for survivors. I've passed 3 laws in 3 states. I do lobbying where I want to fill in the gaps in the laws of the things that I've had to face and that other survivors are having to face. And yeah.
That's amazing. Tell us about those laws. What were they, and what states were you able to successfully get these laws enacted?
Yeah, so the 3 laws were in Texas, Indiana, and Connecticut. And they're specific in their own way because every state is permitted to have a variation of their own laws.
Right.
So But the general gist of them is to ensure that you have the right to a counselor in the room with you when you're being interviewed by police and when you're in the emergency room, and ensuring that that is a guaranteed right, that you have an advocate by your side that can explain the process. Another thing is that your rape kit is paid for and that you are informed that it's paid for. Because in my situation, I was never told, although it was law that I didn't have to pay for my rape kit, I was never told that. And so when I got the bill in the mail, even though I had lost my job and was struggling trying to get through medical appointments and police interviews and everything else, I went into my own pocket because I thought I had to, not realizing that there was an actual process to have that covered. It's just no one told me. And so it's really ensuring a more trauma-informed approach in general of everything that I've had to face, making sure that there are no more gaps in the system to permit that kind of abuse.
That's amazing. Congratulations on getting that taken care of in those 3 locations, and my best to you in moving forward and getting other states to adopt similar laws and better investigative laws, because I know it's needed. Obviously, just listening to your story, it puts so many questions in my mind in terms of what those detectives were thinking. My guess is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but was the police officer that assaulted you, was it the same agency that did the investigation that he worked for?
It was not, but there were suspicions that they were heavily connected and had known each other. Okay. I can't prove that, but... And
with the current timbre and Me Too movement and Start by Believing type programs and ideas and social awareness that's going on out there, do you have any recourse to maybe get your case reopened and reinvestigated now?
I've thought about it. I know that there's an extension of statute of limitations, which matters a lot. A lot of states only have a 2 to 5 year statute of limitations. States like Texas, though, that are kind of like leading in the area, actually, they don't have those statute of limitations. So although it would be possible, I don't know that I could do it all over again. Sure. I just think I fought so hard for so long, and afterwards it took me years to get to the point where I was even ready to move on with my own life, and I just couldn't imagine trying to reopen that. But yeah. I have thought about it.
Yeah. I can completely understand where you're coming from if you were to make the decision that you never wanted to do that. And man, you've been through so much already that reopening it, I can see, would be just another traumatic affair. It's not uncommon for victims and survivors of sexual assault to have intrusive thoughts and nightmares and even everyday experiences that can trigger memories that you'd rather not have. Are you able to tell us a little bit about maybe some of those trauma experiences that you've gone through?
Yeah, I mean, to this day, I still take medications for nightmares. That has been a reoccurring issue since the assault. I have incredible trust issues with law enforcement, but also just people in general. I've had breakdowns in malls where I walked across a display where they had some kind of similar boot that he was wearing, and this was years after the assault, and I was just flooded immediately with flashbacks and memories, and I just stood in the middle of this mall just crying because I was so upset. And at the time I felt embarrassed because I'm like, these are shoes. Like, why would I have such a strong reaction to that? But I even get emotional right now talking about it. But yeah, so I think it's hard because you kind of hope that you reach certain points and you feel a lot better, and then things come up which make it more difficult, and you feel like you start back at the beginning again.
Absolutely. Because what you're talking about is so common when it comes to sexual trauma. And I'm wondering what kind of coping mechanisms you have developed that have helped you get through these triggers. What do you do to help mitigate some of the feelings and responses that probably just surge to the surface?
I think I have, thankfully, through this entire walk of trying to seek justice, but also advocating for others, I've met incredible individuals who also have unfortunately experienced rape and sexual assault. And by far, they are probably the anchor that I go back to over and over again, because there is something incredibly powerful about finding people who have known exactly what you're going through, even if it wasn't the same situation, but knowing that you're not alone and feeling that, you can relate in the sense that, oh, I just got triggered by this thing that I feel like should be ridiculous, but they don't judge. They just say, oh my gosh, like I've had this exact same thing happen to me too. And I think that's the strongest help that I feel like I've been able to have. Immediate things that help is just deep breathing. I don't meditate. I wish I did. I know it's like highly recommended.
Some listeners are probably going to want to know why, if you were unconscious, are you having triggers? And you just mentioned one of them that was visual. You saw a pair of boots. So the trauma that you've experienced then has been post-assault, finding out that you were raped, realizing that you were raped. What are you able to tell us about some of the sounds that may have been associated with finding out that you were raped?
It's interesting. My experience is interesting in the sense that although I don't remember it while it was happening, I had to watch it back on video. Right. And so it's hard to describe that feeling of seeing yourself be attacked, but not knowing at the time that was what was going on. As far as sounds, to this day, I'm very sensitive to people deep breathing. And it's just a trigger for me. I get uncomfortable. I don't like it. It seems really petty to be like, stop breathing around me, but it's just incredibly upsetting still.
This may be surprising to some listeners, but it isn't to me. So I completely understand that and encourage listeners to study and examine and research on their own some of the effects that the senses can have on the body in terms of the trauma experience. So sights and sounds, are you able to recall any smells that particularly affect you with regard to the assault?
No, I think it's visual and sound. I don't have any recollection of smells.
You do have recollection, not only of the seeing the video, but you mentioned earlier the way you felt and seeing the injuries. Are you able to talk a little bit more to us about the physical way you felt when you came out of that unconscious state?
Like the senses in my body, or?
Yeah, some of the pain senses, or just soreness, or even body position.
Yeah, I mean, I was pretty sore all over. I had already had bruises forming. I felt like I had been hit by a car. I had a horrible headache from what I would later find would be hitting my head.
Again, I'm just so sorry for the experience that you lived through. So those physical aspects of your rape, then are any of those traumas remanifested now? You talked about seeing boots. You talked about the breathing. What about the physical pain? Like when you have a headache, does that trigger some of the trauma?
It interestingly does. I've kind of gotten frustrated with myself a little bit in the sense of, headaches can come and just stressful life events, but it does. It's definitely triggering, even just to get a headache, which again, logically just feels frustrating. I guess that there's nothing that I can do to stop that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing these things with us, though. I really do feel that it's important for survivors to understand some of the experience that they're having in terms of triggers if they haven't been taught or educated about what trauma does to the brain and how our brain absorbs it and then encodes it and consolidates those memories, and how things can come back as triggers and nightmares can occur and intrusive thoughts can occur. And those can occur sometimes without even any recognizable trigger. Sometimes our synapse just trigger things, and memories come to mind that we're wondering, where the heck did that come from? Can I ask if that kind of thought process has happened to you, those intrusive thoughts and memories?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Well, I think it's vitally important that you've shared that with us. So thank you for telling us. Can we go back a little bit more into your work now and what your goals are and how you see things working for the benefit of survivors?
Yeah, so currently I'm still doing my lobbying work. I have two state campaigns and one federal campaign currently that I'm acting as a legislative coach for. And it's incredible the fact that I still am meeting survivors who are going through similar things, even if it's not the exact same thing. And it's frustrating for me in the sense that you hope that progress is coming and that it's been made at least a little bit. And when you realize that there's still so much injustice and so much lack of education and training, it can feel defeating. But I, to my core, believe that survivors deserve so much more than the ways in which they've been treated. And I don't see myself stopping the advocacy work until things truly change for everyone. And that's my priority.
Congratulations on that. Do you have any campaigns or social movements that you are involved with or work with that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, so I work for the National Domestic Violence Coalition. I also am their legislative coach.
Wow. Way to go. Thank you. I appreciate that. So tell our audience a little bit about what went on with the United Nations and what you did there.
Yeah, so it was such an incredible experience. We started with an exhibit, actually. It was the What Were You Wearing exhibit. And we took survivors' outfits from across the globe and put them at the United Nations headquarters. So when delegates and diplomats would go through, there was this massive What Were You Wearing exhibit. And they had outfits from children's swimsuits all the way up to military outfits. And my outfit was one of those that was displayed. Then subsequent to that was the resolution. It is the first standalone resolution addressing survivors of sexual violence and ensuring that they have access to justice. And so we had worked on lobbying for that resolution. I was incredibly honored to be able to testify in front of the United Nations on that resolution. And on Friday, it was passed into law. So it was pretty breathtaking to be there in the room when it was voted for. Amazing.
Congratulations on that. And I did. I watched the video you sent out showing that vote, and it really is touching and moving. And I am so grateful for the work that you and others do for victims and survivors around the world. It's really great that you are trying to make an impact, and I know you are, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the panel that you were on, and that was in New York. I was, just so the audience knows, invited to do some training at a small university in upstate New York. And in the afternoon, there was a panel of 4 victims, survivors of campus rape, and Samantha was one of those. Are you able to talk a little bit about how that felt for you to be on a panel like that and tell your story?
Yeah, at that time, it was when I was first starting to get into advocating and speaking out. And so I felt like I was all over the place, probably emotionally and story-wise. But I think it was interesting in the sense that the audience was law enforcement officers, and in a sense that brought up a lot of challenges just by my own experience. But in a way, I felt like it was probably the launch to my healing, was being able to have my voice, even if it was shaking, it was heard, and I was able to say what I had to say, and received incredible support afterwards. And I think that was incredibly moving and healing.
It was impressive. You didn't come across as scattered or nervous at all. I was so impressed with all four of you. In fact, I've mentioned this in, I think, the other interviews with the other ladies that were involved. It was because of you four coming up to me afterwards and having seen my training and telling me that this is the type of information, what I train for a living, is the type of information that survivors and victims need to hear to better understand what their trauma experience is all about, and why they feel the way they feel, why they think the way they think, and where these intrusive nightmares and thoughts and lifestyle patterns come from after a trauma such as this. So I appreciate you coming up and talking to me afterwards. But I also would like for you to tell our audience, if you don't mind, how you've been able to stay in touch with the other three participants.
Yeah, so we stay in pretty close contact. I really do consider them like family. I'm so grateful that I've met them. They're individually and collectively just like the best people that I know, and so incredibly strong. Like everything I think that we've kind of endured, we've always kind of bounced back and been each other's support system at the end. And I think that matters so much, even though, you know, I've moved away from New York and no longer there. I still message them and we still lean on each other. I was just messaging Mac today, actually. So, yeah.
Truly is inspiring to hear that you have that ongoing relationship with them. And I can tell you that they feel the same way about you, that they're super impressed with you. They appreciate you, consider you part of their family, and they have nothing but wonderful things to say about you and your work. And I echo that. It's been amazing to be able to stay in touch with you for these many years, and to actually get to a point of culmination with the request that you four made that I start a podcast. And so I really do trace this very podcast back to that afternoon with you four coming up to me and saying you need to get this information out to survivors and victims. So thank you for your input and for your work.
No, I mean, honestly, that was to sit and be able to, because yeah, when you don't know and you're having these experiences that you can't describe and they feel like they shouldn't be happening and you're just frustrated and you don't know what to do with it. I mean, when I was able to sit there and listen, like, wow, this is common. I'm not just weird. I'm not just going through this thing. And there's others out there who are experiencing this. I mean, I think that in itself was healing. And I think that's incredibly powerful. So absolute credit to you for kind of helping us launch into an even deeper healing.
It's an honor to be able to hear that you feel that I've helped in any way. So thank you for that. What are your thoughts about things that are going on in our world today? The Me Too movement and Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby, and whether or not you think any of this is really having a good impact, or is it ultimately not helping? What are your thoughts?
No, so I absolutely think that the Me Too movement has given people a voice. For example, so I do bystander intervention training occasionally at undergraduate schools, and it mattered so. Like the Me Too movement had such an impact that when I was teaching these kids things that when I was in undergrad, I had no idea how to respond to somebody who comes to you and is saying that they were just assaulted. How do you look out for your friends? How do you intervene in a safe way so that you can do something before an assault might happen on campus? And it was amazing the amount of information that these students already knew because of the Me Too movement and social media and Start By Believing campaign and all of these wonderful organizations who are out there promoting truly believing survivors and stopping the traumatic cycle of just the constant denial and silence. So I'm hopeful in the sense that I think things are getting better now. Obviously, there are still massive gaps in laws. States are still not getting it right. There's police departments who still need a lot more trauma-informed training, but I have to hope that things are on the rise.
I still agree with that, and I appreciate those comments. I think they're helpful. And I really do think the audience that will be listening to this podcast and absorbing this information then will probably do things like reach out to others who advocate for the same things that you are. Samantha, would it be okay for you if we maybe plan on doing another podcast in the not too distant future and tying some of the things that we've talked about today into some of the things that happen between today and whenever we do get to talk again, and whether or not you've had any contact from people who may have listened to your podcast? I'd really like to do some follow-up work with you on this.
Yeah, I'm absolutely happy to.
That would be amazing. Let me throw something at you too. What would you think about, I've been playing with this in my head for about 3 or 4 days now. What do you think about a conference call with all 4 of you on the podcast?
That'd be so cool.
Would you like that? I thought it would be too.
Yeah.
I think it would be awesome to have all 4 of you on at the same time.
No, and like us sharing our story, I think for all 4 of us was really for the first time in a public place together. So it's honestly more comforting, I think, to kind of have them around, and being on a call with them, that would be great.
Cool. I think I'll try and arrange that. Well, Sam, I really appreciate your time. It's been enlightening, it's been educational, it's been helpful, and it's been uplifting, and I'm really positive and want to give a really good send-off to you with the knowledge that this is really going to touch lives in really good ways.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I'm absolutely looking forward to hearing from you again.
Thanks, Sam. I appreciate you. We'll talk to you later.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day.
That does it for another episode of SAS. Thanks for listening. Listen to a new episode each week. And please remember to subscribe, rate each episode, and spread the word about this important podcast, because we all know someone who's been affected by sexual assault or rape. Remember to start by believing, and let's all do our share to help bring justice to victims of rape and sexual assault. We'll talk to you next week.